Do you know what happens when someone mistakes dignity for weakness? The question never reached the ballroom microphones. Yet before the night was over, every guest inside the Grand Regent Hotel would know the answer. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble floors as nearly 500 of the country's most influential investors, executives, and philanthropists gathered beneath ceilings painted with gold leaf. Soft jazz floated through the room. Champagne glasses shimmered under the lights, and conversations worth hundreds of millions of dollars unfolded behind effortless smiles. Tonight was supposed to belong to the Whitmore family. Richard Whitmore stood near the center of the ballroom, greeting business leaders with the quiet confidence of a man who believed success had already chosen him. His wife, Victoria Whitmore, wore an elegant ivory gown that photographers couldn't stop admiring, while their son, Ethan, moved comfortably from one conversation to another, introducing himself as the future of Whitmore Holdings. Rumor had already spread through the Gala that before midnight, an international investment fund would announce a $1 billion partnership that could transform the family company into one of the largest private infrastructure firms in America. Everyone wanted to shake their hands. Everyone wanted to be seen standing beside them. Along the edges of the ballroom, nearly invisible to the guests, the event staff worked with practiced precision. Silver trays glided between conversations. White tablecloths remained perfectly smooth. Every candle burned with identical brightness. Naomi Brooks checked each detail with calm, measured attention. Her black evening uniform blended into the background by design, and that was exactly how she preferred it. She quietly adjusted a centerpiece that leaned slightly to one side, thanked a nervous young server for catching a small mistake before anyone noticed, and continued moving through the room with the steady confidence of someone who never needed recognition to do her job well. Most guests never looked directly at her. They saw a staff member, nothing more. Naomi had long ago learned that people often revealed their true character by how they treated those they believed could offer them nothing. She carried herself with quiet grace anyway. Across the ballroom, a member of the investment committee arrived without fanfare. Unlike the celebrities entering through the main doors, he declined interviews and simply observed the room from a distance. Several executives noticed him immediately, but few approached. His expression remained unreadable as his eyes slowly scanned the guests, the service staff, the conversations, and the atmosphere that numbers alone could never measure. Richard Whitmore spotted him and smiled to himself. Everything was unfolding exactly as planned. At least, that's what he believed. Moments later, one of the younger servers lost his footing when another guest unexpectedly stepped backward. A champagne flute tilted. Only a few drops escaped before Naomi reacted instinctively, stepping forward and catching the tray before it could crash onto the marble floor. The glasses remained intact. No guest was touched. The music never stopped. But Victoria Whitmore turned just in time to see Naomi standing beside her with the tray still in her hands. Her expression hardened before anyone could explain what had actually happened. In one swift motion, she raised her hand and struck Naomi sharply across the cheek. The sound echoed far louder than the orchestra. Conversation stopped. Crystal glasses froze halfway to waiting lips. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the center of the ballroom. Naomi neither stepped backward nor answered with anger. She simply lifted one hand to her cheek, drew a slow breath, and met Victoria's eyes with remarkable composure. At the opposite end of the ballroom, the chairman of the investment fund quietly lowered the glass he had just picked up. He did not speak. He did not intervene. He simply watched Naomi instead of the woman who had humiliated her. And in that silent decision, the future of a billion-dollar deal had already begun to change. The silence lingered for several long seconds before the orchestra cautiously resumed its melody, but the music no longer carried the warmth it had only. Moments before, conversations returned in whispers instead of laughter. Some guests exchanged uneasy glances. Others pretended nothing unusual had happened, choosing the comfort of polite smiles over uncomfortable truth. Naomi Brooks slowly lowered her hand from her cheek. There was no anger in her expression, only steady composure. She looked toward the frightened young server whose hands still trembled around the silver tray and offered him a reassuring smile, so gentle that his breathing finally steadied. "It is all right," she said softly. No one was hurt. The young man nodded with grateful eyes, unable to find the words. Victoria Whitmore adjusted the sleeve of her gown as though nothing significant had occurred. "Someone should teach the staff to stay out of the guests' way," she said coolly before turning back toward the circle of executives surrounding her. Several people laughed politely, although the sound felt forced, as if they were laughing because silence would have required courage. Richard Whitmore noticed the awkward shift in the room and stepped closer to his wife. "The investors are watching," he whispered. Victoria gave a dismissive shrug. Then they saw someone protecting her evening. Richard wanted to believe she was right. He had spent the last 18 months negotiating what could become the defining partnership of his career. Every financial projection, every presentation, every dinner meeting had led to tonight. One unpleasant moment with an event coordinator could not possibly matter more than $1 billion in opportunity. That was how business worked. Or so he believed. Across the ballroom, the chairman of the investment fund quietly spoke with two members of his committee. Their conversation lasted less than a minute. No one could hear the words, but each of them briefly looked toward Naomi before returning their attention to the Whitmore family. Naomi bent down and straightened one of the velvet ropes that separated the ballroom from the private reception lounge. Her movements remained calm, almost graceful, as though she refused to let another person's actions determine her own character. A guest in his 70s approached her with quiet concern. "Are you all right?" he asked. Naomi offered the same composed smile she had worn throughout the evening. "Thank you for asking. I am fine." The gentleman nodded thoughtfully before walking away, carrying with him far more questions than answers. Few people in the room knew anything about Naomi Brooks beyond the black uniform she wore. They did not know that only 4 years earlier she had advised multinational companies through some of the largest merger negotiations in North America. They did not know she had left a celebrated career without public announcement after her mother received a devastating diagnosis that demanded every hour Naomi could give. For 3 years, she had traded conference rooms for hospital waiting areas, quarterly reports for medication schedules, and prestigious titles for quiet acts of love that no award ceremony would ever recognize. After her mother's passing, returning to corporate finance had proven more difficult than she imagined. Employers noticed the gap in her resume before they noticed her accomplishments. Eventually, she accepted temporary work coordinating high-profile events while rebuilding her professional life, one careful step at a time. Very few people ever asked about her story. Tonight, she had not come to impress anyone. She had come simply to ensure an important evening unfolded without problems. Yet somewhere beyond the crystal chandeliers and polished marble, unseen consequences were already beginning to move with silent precision, and the people celebrating their greatest victory had no idea that the true evaluation of their character had only just begun. Richard Whitmore lifted another crystal glass as more guests gathered around him, their congratulations arriving one after another with practiced enthusiasm. Every smile seemed to confirm what he had repeated to his board for months, that Whitmore Holdings was about to enter a new era. The anticipated investment was more than capital. It was validation. It would open doors to international markets, attract institutional partners, and place the family name alongside the most respected companies in the country. Ethan Whitmore stood beside a large architectural model displaying the company's newest infrastructure project, answering questions with polished confidence. He spoke about innovation, responsibility, and long-term partnerships, carefully repeating the phrases prepared by the communications team. Investors nodded with approval while cameras captured every handshake. Victoria moved effortlessly between conversations, accepting compliments about the gala and thanking donors with flawless elegance. To everyone watching from a distance, the Whitmores appeared untouchable, the perfect image of wealth, discipline, and success. Yet beneath that polished surface, another conversation was quietly unfolding inside the private reception lounge reserved for the investment committee. Heavy oak doors softened the sound of the ballroom outside. The chairman stood beside floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, his hands resting lightly behind his back as several senior advisors reviewed notes on digital tablets. Financial projections remained impressive. Revenue growth exceeded expectations. Risk assessments appeared manageable. Every spreadsheet suggested approval. Even so, the chairman remained unusually quiet. Finally, one advisor broke the silence. "The numbers support the partnership." Another nodded. "Operationally, They are one of the strongest candidates this year. The chairman looked toward the ballroom through the glass. Character does not appear on financial statements, he replied calmly. The room became still. Everyone serving on the committee understood exactly what he meant because their investment philosophy had never focused on profits alone. Every major partnership required passing an internal leadership evaluation that extended beyond accounting reports and legal documents. They invested in people before they invested in companies. Outside the lounge, Naomi continued coordinating the evening with remarkable professionalism. She quietly instructed the catering team to adjust the dessert presentation after noticing a guest with severe food allergies speaking with the chef. She asked maintenance to dim one overly bright spotlight that reflected directly into the audience. Seating. She thanked every employee she passed, from the valet attendants to the housekeeping staff, replacing fresh towels in the nearby restrooms. None of these actions attracted applause. Few guests even noticed. Yet the people working beside her noticed every one of them. A longtime banquet supervisor watched Naomi from across the hallway and quietly smiled to himself. During 30 years in hospitality, he had met countless managers who demanded respect without offering any. Naomi had always been different. She never raised her voice. She never reminded people of her authority. She simply treated everyone with the same steady kindness, whether they wore tailored suits or housekeeping uniforms. Back inside the ballroom, Richard glanced toward the entrance of the reception lounge as the chairman emerged once again. The conversations around the room gradually softened. Anticipation spread through the crowd like a gentle current moving beneath calm water. Richard straightened his jacket. Ethan adjusted his tie. Victoria smiled confidently as photographers positioned themselves for what everyone assumed would become tomorrow morning's biggest business headline. Only Naomi seemed untouched by the growing excitement. She quietly collected an empty water glass from a side table before stepping aside to allow guests an unobstructed view of the stage, completely unaware that the smallest choices she had made throughout the evening were about to outweigh every presentation, every projection, and every promise the Whitmore family had spent years preparing. The chairman walked toward the stage with measured confidence, greeting several longtime partners along the way, but instead of taking his place behind the podium immediately, he paused beside a little girl standing near one of the front tables. She could not have been older than 9, wearing a navy blue dress and holding a small sketchbook against her chest. She smiled as he leaned down to whisper something that made her quietly laugh. The guests watched with polite curiosity before returning their attention to the stage, assuming it was simply a grandfather sharing a private moment with his granddaughter. Only a handful of people knew that the chairman trusted the child's observations more than most executive reports because she had a remarkable habit of noticing what adults ignored. Earlier that evening, while waiting for the announcement, she had wandered through the ballroom sketching flowers, chandeliers, and smiling faces. She had also witnessed something else. Now, as the chairman straightened, he gently asked, "Emily, did you enjoy the evening?" The little girl nodded before answering with complete innocence. Most people were nice. She hesitated for a moment, then quietly added, "But the lady in the white dress was not." The chairman did not interrupt. "What happened?" Emily looked toward Naomi, who was carefully arranging glasses on a nearby service station as though nothing unusual had happened. The lady thought Miss Naomi spilled something, but she did not. Miss Naomi stopped the glasses from falling. She even protected the young waiter because he looked scared. Then the lady embarrassed her anyway. The chairman remained silent. Did Miss Naomi say anything mean back? Emily slowly shook her head. No. She smiled at the waiter instead. She made sure he was all right before she worried about herself. The chairman followed his granddaughter's gaze. Across the ballroom, Naomi noticed that one of the floral displays had begun leaning after guests brushed against the table several times. She quietly adjusted the arrangement before replacing a single white rose that had slipped loose onto the marble floor. Her movements remained calm, unhurried, and completely free of resentment. She behaved exactly the same way she had before the incident, as though kindness was simply part of who she was rather than something offered only when life felt fair. Nearby, 2 catering employees spoke in hushed voices. "I thought she would leave," one whispered. The other shook his head. "She stayed because everyone else still has a job to do." Neither realized the chairman had heard every word while walking toward the stage. Richard Whitmore, meanwhile, checked his watch with growing excitement. Everything appeared back on schedule. The photographers had assembled. Reporters waited with cameras aimed toward the podium. His legal counsel quietly confirmed that the ceremonial agreement folders had been placed exactly where they belonged. Ethan smiled confidently as he rehearsed the handshake he expected would appear on the front page of every business publication the following morning. Victoria adjusted the diamond bracelet around her wrist and admired the reflection of the ballroom lights dancing across its polished surface. None of them noticed the chairman pause one final time before stepping onto the stage. He looked first at Naomi, then slowly across the room at the Whitmore family. His expression revealed neither anger nor approval, only thoughtful certainty. Somewhere beyond the ballroom windows, the lights of the city shimmered against the dark evening sky, while inside the Grand Regent Hotel, the room filled with hopeful applause as everyone prepared for an announcement they believed would celebrate extraordinary success, unaware that the standard by which success was about to be measured had quietly changed. The applause slowly faded as the chairman reached the podium, resting one hand lightly against its polished wood surface while the ballroom settled into complete silence. The towering crystal chandeliers reflected across hundreds of attentive faces, and for a brief moment, the room felt suspended between expectation and history. Richard Whitmore stood with his family only a few feet away, already imagining the headlines that would appear by sunrise. He caught Ethan's eye and offered a small confident nod. This was the moment they had earned. Every late-night negotiation, every presentation, every carefully cultivated relationship had led here. At the back of the ballroom, Naomi quietly collected a folded linen napkin left behind on an empty cocktail table before stepping toward the service entrance, believing her responsibilities were nearly finished. She had no interest in the announcement itself. The success or failure of wealthy executives was no longer the center of her world. What mattered to her was making certain every guest left feeling cared for, regardless of title or status. Just before she reached the doorway, she heard the chairman begin to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this evening. Before discussing investments, partnerships, or financial opportunities, I would like to share something our organization has believed since its founding." His calm voice carried effortlessly across the ballroom. Balance sheets reveal performance. Contracts reveal preparation. But character reveals whether success can be trusted. Several executives exchanged curious glances. This was not the speech anyone expected. Richard's smile faded ever so slightly, though he remained confident. The chairman continued. "Our firm evaluates every opportunity using many measurements. Revenue, governance, long-term strategy, innovation. Those are important. However, there is another measurement that cannot be manufactured inside a presentation or polished inside a boardroom." He paused long enough for the silence to become noticeable. It is how people choose to treat another human being when they believe nothing is at stake. The room grew perfectly still. Victoria folded her hands together, her expression composed, yet an unfamiliar uncertainty crossed her face. The chairman slowly stepped away from the podium and looked across the ballroom until his eyes rested on Naomi. "Miss Brooks," he said warmly, "would you please join me for a moment?" Naomi stopped walking. Several members of the hotel staff looked at one another in confusion. She hesitated, glancing toward her supervisor, who quietly nodded. With measured steps, she crossed the marble floor beneath the gaze of every guest in attendance. Her black uniform stood in quiet contrast against the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. No one spoke. Even the photographers lowered their cameras, sensing something unexpected was unfolding. Naomi reached the stage and offered a respectful smile. "Good evening, sir." The chairman returned the smile. "Good evening, Miss Brooks." He turned back toward the audience. "Most of you see an event coordinator standing beside me tonight. My granddaughter saw something different." Emily quietly stood from her chair near the front row, still holding her small sketchbook. Against her chest, she watched Miss Brooks protect a young employee from embarrassment, continue serving others with grace after being publicly humiliated, and offer kindness where many people would have chosen resentment. Richard felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Ethan slowly lowered the agreement folder in his hands. Victoria's confident posture became noticeably rigid. Around the ballroom, Conversations disappeared entirely as guests began replaying the evening inside their own memories. The chairman allowed the silence to settle before speaking once more, and every word seemed heavier than the last. Tonight, our committee did not learn the most important lesson from a financial report. We learned it from the person everyone else overlooked. No one moved. The ballroom had become so quiet that the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed louder than the orchestra had only minutes before. Naomi stood beside the chairman with her hands gently folded in front of her, her posture relaxed despite the hundreds of eyes fixed upon her. She had not asked to be on the stage. She had not expected recognition. She simply waited with the same quiet patience she had carried throughout the evening. The chairman looked toward the audience before speaking again. Several years ago, our organization changed the way we evaluate leadership. We discovered that impressive financial results can be achieved in many ways, but lasting partnerships can only be built on trust. He paused, allowing his words to settle naturally across the room. Every major investment includes what we call an integrity review. We observe how leaders treat employees, strangers, service workers, and people who have no influence over the outcome of a business transaction. Those moments reveal more than any quarterly report ever will. A ripple of uncertainty passed through the crowd. Several executives quietly lowered their glasses onto nearby tables. Others glanced toward the Whitmore family before quickly looking away. Richard Whitmore felt the confidence that had carried him all evening begin to slip beneath his polished expression. His legal counsel leaned closer and whispered, "I did not know. They conducted behavioral evaluations." Richard answered without taking his eyes off the stage. "Neither did I." Victoria remained perfectly still, though her breathing had become noticeably slower. For the first time that evening, she replayed the incident exactly as it had happened. She remembered Naomi catching the tray before it could fall. She remembered the frightened young server. She remembered choosing assumption over understanding. Across the ballroom, Emily quietly opened her sketchbook. On one page, she had drawn the crystal chandeliers above the dance floor. On another, she had sketched Naomi helping the young waiter steady the silver tray. The child smiled faintly as she looked at the drawing, unaware that the simple picture reflected the truth more clearly than any security camera ever could. The chairman accepted the sketchbook from his granddaughter and held it gently in one hand. "Children often notice what successful adults overlook," he said. "They recognize kindness before they recognize status." A few guests lowered their heads. Others nodded almost imperceptibly. Naomi finally spoke, her voice calm and respectful. "Sir, I appreciate your generosity, but the young waiter deserves just as much credit. He worked very hard tonight." The chairman smiled warmly. "That answer is exactly why you are standing here." Naomi lowered her eyes for a brief moment, not out of embarrassment, but humility. She had spent years learning that true strength rarely needed to announce itself. It simply remained steady when circumstances invited bitterness. Soft light from the chandeliers reflected across the polished stage, illuminating the faint mark that still lingered on her cheek. But what people noticed now was no longer the mark itself. They noticed the grace with which she carried it. Around the ballroom, conversations had disappeared entirely. Expensive watches, tailored tuxedos, designer gowns, and million-dollar ambitions suddenly felt strangely insignificant against one simple truth unfolding in complete silence. The chairman slowly closed Emily's sketchbook and placed it on the podium beside him. Then he looked directly toward Richard, Victoria, and Ethan Whitmore. His expression remained calm, professional, and entirely without anger. When he finally spoke again, every person in the ballroom understood that the next sentence would determine not only the future of a business partnership, but the legacy of a family that had believed success could never be questioned. The chairman allowed several quiet seconds to pass before speaking, his calm voice carrying across the ballroom with a certainty that silenced even the faint clinking of crystal glasses. After reviewing every financial document, every legal assessment, and every operational report, our committee reached a unanimous conclusion. Richard Whitmore straightened instinctively, expecting to hear the announcement he had anticipated for months. Ethan lifted his chin, ready for the cameras. Victoria forced a composed smile back onto her face. Then the chairman continued. "Whitmore Holdings will not receive our $1 billion investment." A collective breath swept through the room. No one gasped loudly. No one shouted. The disappointment settled like heavy rain over polished marble, quiet yet impossible to ignore. Richard blinked once, certain he had misunderstood. "There must be some mistake," he said, stepping forward with measured restraint. "If there is additional documentation you require, we can provide it immediately." The chairman gently shook his head. "This decision has nothing to do with your financial documents." Richard's confidence faltered. "Then what is the issue?" The chairman looked toward Naomi before returning his attention to the audience. "Leadership is demonstrated long before contracts are signed. Tonight your family showed us how power is exercised when no one believes accountability exists." Victoria's face slowly lost its color. "Surely one unfortunate misunderstanding cannot erase 18 months of negotiations," she said quietly. The chairman answered without hesitation. "A misunderstanding is corrected by listening. An assumption becomes a choice when someone refuses to seek the truth." The room remained perfectly still. Several investors who had planned to congratulate the Whitmores only minutes earlier quietly stepped back without realizing they had done so. Ethan looked toward Naomi for the first time that evening, not as an employee, but as a person. He remembered watching her comfort the frightened young waiter instead of defending herself. He remembered dismissing the moment because it did not seem important. Now it had become the most important moment of the entire gala. The chairman reached into a leather portfolio resting beside the podium and removed a single document. "Our organization believes culture flows from leadership. If respect disappears at the top, eventually integrity disappears throughout the company. We cannot invest $1 billion into a culture that failed its simplest test." He carefully closed the folder without asking anyone to sign it. The ceremonial agreement that photographers had prepared to capture would remain untouched. Camera flashes stopped completely. Reporters lowered their notebooks, realizing the story had changed before their eyes. Richard stood speechless as months of preparation dissolved into silence. The chairman then turned toward Naomi with genuine respect. "Miss Brooks, you did not know you were being observed. You expected nothing in return for your professionalism, your patience, or your kindness. That is precisely why your actions carried such weight." Naomi lowered her eyes modestly. "I only tried to do my job, sir." "You did far more than that," the chairman replied. "You reminded everyone in this room that character is never measured by position. It is measured by choices." Warm light from the chandeliers reflected across the stage as no one dared interrupt the moment. The billion-dollar partnership had disappeared without an argument, without raised voices, and without negotiation. It had been decided not by market conditions, legal language, or financial performance, but by a single choice made in front of someone who believed that the true value of any company begins with the way it treats the person least able to change its future. Richard Whitmore remained motionless as the unsigned agreement folder rested quietly on the podium, looking heavier now than any document he had ever carried. Around the ballroom, guests who had once competed for his attention slowly drifted into separate conversations, not out of cruelty, but because the certainty that had surrounded his family only minutes earlier had disappeared. Victoria lowered her eyes for the first time that evening. The confidence that had defined every step she had taken across the marble floor was gone, replaced by a silence she could not escape. Ethan looked at his parents, then at Naomi, replaying every moment from earlier in the night. The more he remembered, the less he recognized the version of success he had grown up believing in. Without saying a word, Richard walked toward the stage. His polished shoes echoed softly against the marble floor, each step carrying none of the confidence they had only minutes before. When he reached Naomi, he stopped several feet away. There were no cameras flashing now, no applause, no reporters leaning forward, only quiet. Richard drew a slow breath before speaking. "Miss Brooks, I spent my entire career believing that reputation was built through accomplishments. Tonight, I learned it can be lost through a single choice." Naomi listened without interrupting. Richard continued, his voice steady but noticeably softer. "I cannot undo what happened, but I can acknowledge that we failed you. I failed you." Victoria slowly joined him. Her hands were clasped together so tightly that the diamond bracelet she had admired earlier no longer seemed important. She looked directly into Naomi's eyes, something she had not done all evening. "I judged you before I understood the truth," she said quietly. "There is no excuse for that. I am sincerely sorry." The ballroom remained completely silent. Every guest waited to see how Naomi would respond. Some expected anger. Others expected satisfaction. Instead, Naomi offered the same calm expression she had carried from the beginning of the evening. "Thank you for saying that," she replied gently. "An apology matters because it shows someone is willing to see another person differently than they did before." Victoria blinked, surprised by the absence of resentment. "Can you forgive us?" she asked almost in a whisper. Naomi paused for only a moment. "Forgiveness does not erase what happened," she answered. "It simply keeps that moment from deciding who I become tomorrow." Her words settled across the ballroom with quiet strength. She continued, "Every one of us has moments that reveal our character. Tonight revealed yours. Tomorrow gives you the opportunity to build a different one." Ethan lowered his head, humbled by the grace standing before him. Even the chairman smiled faintly, recognizing that no lecture could have taught the lesson as powerfully as Naomi's response. Emily walked onto the stage carrying her small sketchbook and offered Naomi a page she had just finished drawing. It showed a woman helping another person while light from the chandeliers surrounded them. Above the drawing, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "Kind people make every room brighter." Naomi accepted the sketch with both hands and smiled warmly at the little girl. "Thank you, Emily. I will treasure this." The chairman stepped beside them and quietly said, "Some partnerships cannot be signed with ink. They are earned through integrity." Naomi nodded respectfully. The ballroom remained silent once again, but this time the silence no longer carried embarrassment. It carried reflection, and for many people standing beneath those crystal chandeliers, that quiet reflection would become the most valuable thing they took home that night. 1 year later, the Grand Regent Hotel hosted another charity gala beneath the same crystal chandeliers that had witnessed a night no one in the city's business community had forgotten. The marble floors still reflected warm golden light. The orchestra still filled the ballroom with quiet elegance. Yet something had changed in ways that no decorator could create. Staff members were greeted by name. Servers were thanked before the evening even began. Executives paused to hold doors open for housekeeping employees, pushing supply carts through the corridors. It had become an unspoken tradition among many of the city's business leaders that every person in the room deserved the same measure of respect, regardless of title or position. Naomi Brooks arrived through the front entrance this time, wearing a navy blue business suit instead of an event uniform. A simple name badge identified her as Director of Leadership and Ethics for the International Investment Fund. She carried no sense of triumph, only the same quiet confidence that had always guided her. Several hotel employees recognized her immediately and smiled. She greeted every one of them just as warmly as she had when they worked side by side. Nothing about success had changed the way she looked at people. Near the ballroom entrance, Richard Whitmore waited with Victoria and Ethan. Their company had spent the past year rebuilding its culture instead of pursuing rapid expansion. They had introduced leadership training, anonymous employee feedback programs, and community partnerships focused on dignity in the workplace. Progress had been slow, but genuine. When Naomi approached, Richard extended his hand. "Thank you for giving us a reason to become better than we were." Naomi shook his hand with a gentle smile. "You made that choice yourselves." Victoria's eyes reflected a quiet humility that had replaced the certainty she once carried. "I still think about that evening," she admitted softly. Naomi nodded. "So do I. Not because of what happened to me, but because of what happened afterward." Ethan smiled. "You taught us that reputation is built one conversation at a time." Before Naomi could answer, Emily hurried across the ballroom, carrying another sketchbook. She was a year older now, taller, and just as observant. She opened to a fresh drawing. This time it showed dozens of people standing together beneath bright chandeliers, none larger than another, every face drawn at the same height. At the bottom she had written in careful handwriting, "Respect is the brightest light in every room." Naomi looked at the picture for several quiet seconds before thanking her with genuine warmth. The chairman watched from nearby, saying nothing. He did not need to. The room itself told the story. As the evening came to an end, guests slowly departed beneath the soft glow of the entrance lights. Naomi stepped outside onto the wide stone terrace overlooking the city. A cool evening breeze moved gently through the trees lining the avenue below. Traffic drifted quietly in the distance while the skyline shimmered beneath countless lights stretching toward the horizon. She stood there for a moment with Emily's drawings carefully tucked beneath her arm. Behind her, the ballroom doors opened and closed as laughter and conversation floated softly into the night, sounding warmer than they had a year before. Naomi took one slow breath, smiled to herself, and walked down the front steps with calm, steady purpose. The lights behind her continued to glow, but she never looked back, because some victories do not echo through applause. They live quietly inside the hearts of people who choose kindness after finally learning what true strength looks like.